Got a pre-hung door going in here, and we've got a brick facade. So we're gonna use brick molding. Here's the old stuff, and they've got new stuff that's in black. Protect your floor. These get messy. Gonna remove the locks, remove any alarms, and then remove the casing. I like to get the door and frame apart. I have them inside because these get installed from the inside. So we got a 36 by 80 right hand in swing with a 4.5 inch jamb. Take out the strike plates because those can be screwed into the studs. Because I'm going to have to reuse it. If you're not reusing it, just rip it off. If I'm going to reuse my casing, I like to get it cleaned up as soon as I take it off. You're not doing a refinishing job, but just get them cleaned up a little bit. Get the nails out of the wall as well. You want everything nice and clean. I'm going to score it carefully. Doorbell here, obviously, so I'm going to unscrew that and figure out how that's wired. We could pop the door off and get the jamb out. Sometimes you can see where they put screws in. Like there's a screw right there. Sometimes you can't see the screws or get to them. Sometimes they're all nailed in. Easiest way to get it out is take your circular saw and just run it right across the jamb. And then you can pry the jamb out in pieces. This one was so weakly installed, I just removed 4 screws and then the whole jamb just pops right out. All of the foam, the caulk, pull out any nails, get this thing all cleaned up. And always clean up as you go, especially when it gets real messy. Normally I would pull out anything like this, but this quarter round is glued in, so I'm just gonna leave it there and see if we can make that work. If not, I might replace it. This is well covered. This has a full cover here. And this home is 12 years old. And as you can see, this has never gotten wet. So waterproofing is not an issue. If this was a 2nd story balcony, you would not want to leave something like that because that could go right down through a wall. Or if this was not covered, if it had a lot of exposure, you would want to waterproof this. Here's the waterproofing membrane that went on before the brick went on. So there's really not a lot you can do here. But if this was not covered and it had a lot of exposure, what I would do is just fill in this gap here with caulk. And that's about all you can do. You're not gonna pull off the brick and put in some sort of moisture barrier there. And it's really not necessary. I mean, common sense tells you this does not get wet. You know, if this was a wood foundation or 2nd story, you could put down a piece of thin metal or a plastic pan. That way, if water got under here, it would drain out. If you're doing brand new construction, that's a different story because this vapor barrier has to wrap all the way around here to be up to code. But when you're putting these in, you have to install them from the inside out in most cases. So I've dropped it down on the other side of that quarter round. We're gonna tilt it up into place and you can see it just fits in there. And whenever you're test fitting, it has to fit in loosely. If you have to hammer this thing into position, your space is not big enough. Our door is gonna come right to here, and that's almost 1.5 inches off the floor. And that's plenty of room. If this was down too low, then you'd have to put boards or mortar or something underneath to raise it up. If it was up too high, you'd have to remove whatever is underneath to get it down low. It has to be high enough off the ground so that the door can operate, but it has to be low enough so that it can actually fit. Now I've got this extra piece. This is called door armor. And I don't install these very often, but the client wanted this, so I've got it on there. And this is a security product. And they can be difficult to install once the door and frame have been installed, because you need space for them. But if you're installing one of these with a pre-hung, it's best to install it along with the frame, because you often need extra space and you can move this thing back and forth. So it makes it easier to install while you're installing the frame. So I'm going to take off my weather stripping. I always pre-drill 5 or 6 holes. You might not use them all, but it's better to have them. So I've done that on both sides. We want to start ideally with our threshold level. So I just took it out and I swept this area and vacuumed it, and now you can see we're perfectly level. And I like to use these synthetic shims. They're easier to break off, and when you put a screw through them, they don't split and fall apart on you. So now that it's level and everything fits, I've got 2 thick beads of caulk in there. I want to get the frame centered and then make sure I can get my door square. I'm going to shim just the top on each side about a 1/2 inch and put a screw on the top of each side just to get it centered, and then I'll work my way down from there. So with my foot on the threshold, holding it down, I want to make sure that my jamb is flush with the inside wall. You don't want this uneven because it makes it very difficult to put in the casing. When you're going into existing construction, it just has to be flush with the wall. And I've got my shims in place, and I just put in a 2-inch screw. Once I know everything's fine, I'm going to replace that with a 3-inch screw. I'm going to check the jamb for square and then put in another shim up here and put in a screw. With my carpenter square against the hinge side, I push it up till it hits, and you see it's touching all the way across. That means it's square. If it was not square, I'd have to move the jamb around. Now again, I've got my foot on the threshold to hold it down. And since I know this is the spacing that I want, I just push in the shims until it's nice and snug. The jamb flush with the inside wall from top to bottom. You might not get that perfect, but get it as good as you can. And you don't need to send these screws, 1/2 inch deep into the jamb. Just get them nice and snug so nothing's moving. So I check it again, and we're looking good. So now that those are set, I'm just gonna work on the hinge side only. I wanna get in 3 screws. See, that's perfectly plumb. So I can just shim that in place. And I'm gonna put in the middle screw and the bottom screw. And that's all I'll need to hang the door and test it. And since I know the jamb is in the position that I want, I just put the shims in from each side until they touch and they're snug. Don't bend the jamb. With that screw snug down, check for plumb again. We're looking good. I got the bottom one shimmed, the screw is in there. We check again, we're looking good. I only have a 2-foot level with me today. It's best to use a 4-foot level. We still only have the 1 screw on the strike side, but that's fine. That's enough to hold the jamb in place. We're gonna put our hinges in and hang the door and test it. Here's my hinge pin. Gonna put that right in the tool belt so it's ready. I've got the other half of the top hinge here on the door ready to go. So I'm gonna bring the door over. I'm gonna set it on here, put in my hinge pin, and I'm gonna swing the door around. I have my wedges here ready to prop the door open, and outside I've got my driver and my screws ready to go. My hinges are closed. This is the first test fit. And we'll see how it looks. First test. First thing I want to check is the top. How does my gap look? It's probably very hard to see since it's black. But that gap looks excellent. And we've got a nice gap down the side. I don't care about the gap down the side because see, I can shim this thing. I can screw this in to fit. But we're looking good. And I want to make sure it opens and closes properly and it's not dragging. Now see up here, this gap looks very big and it looks like the jamb kind of curves that way a little bit. So maybe I'll back off that screw a little bit and put another shim in there, and that'll push the jamb over. And now I just jam 3 shims in there. When I do this, I call it the kicker. I'm gonna pound these in, and that'll just push that jamb over a little bit. Another thing I want to check is my alignment. Is the door flush with the jamb? I run my fingers down. It actually feels like the top could go a little bit that way because this is flush. But in the bottom, the jamb sticks out a little bit. So my jamb is going like this. So I'm just gonna push the top that way a little bit, and that'll be fine. I just took that screw out, pull these shims out a little bit so this thing has room. And I've taken out all of the weather stripping because that gives me a better read on the alignment. Not worried about the gaps yet, but I'm worried about the alignment. See this? See how the door touches the stop? From top to bottom. That's how you want it. So now we know this thing is aligned properly. We're gonna put the rest of our screws in here so that the hinge side is totally secure. Now that we're good, I'm gonna put screws in here, but without shims. I just put my screw in here, since I know everything's aligned, and I just sink it in until this jamb is in the position that I want with the right gap. Now that gap is a little bit big for me, but I'm putting in this door armor, so I want it a little bit big. So now that I know that's where I want it, I'll stick the shims in there and make it nice and tight. So I put my door armor plate in place with the 1 screw, and then I'll just test it. I gotta make sure it closes and still has a gap. See, it's a little tight right there, so I'll loosen this shim. So I shim this part and get that fit. Then I work my way down. Then I shim the middle part and get that to fit. I'm checking my gaps. Then you put in your shims, put in your next screw, put in your shims, put in your next screw, work your way all the way down, checking your gap all the way. Make sure that the door works properly and that everything is aligned properly. I'm gonna put the weather stripping in, and that'll help me double check all the gaps. Again, we don't want to see any daylight, and we do not, and that looks awesome. When I have to cut out the shims, I just take a chisel, put it right in there and give it a whack, cuts them off nice and clean, easy. So what I want to do is put on my inside casing first, then I'll put in the expanding foam, then I'll put on my outside casing. Because if I just shoot the foam in there without casing, it could go all over the place. When you're putting the casing back on, I highly recommend getting a nailer. No, just some standard household spackle is fine. We're gonna drill this out to get the doorbell reinstalled. Now I've got my brick mold back on, and I forgot to roll the camera when I put the foam in there, but it's in. Black putty, I can fill these holes, tape everything off. And once it's in there, I'll just wipe it off with a paper towel and then pull off the tape, and it will look beautiful. Look how pretty that is. That looks great. I just gotta get that bottom cleaned up.
And the last step is to install the locks, and these might look unusual because this customer had me install the entire door armor security kit, which you can see in another video. But this is done.
And there we go. A beautifully installed pre-hung door with brick molding.